No one knows exactly what brought Marcelo to that point. All we know is that he got there. He was exhausted, spiritually drained, emotionally broken, and physically ill. It hadn't been a major accident or a scandalous sin. It was just the sum of many bad days. He himself said it was like being lost in the middle of a desert that never ended. He woke up every day feeling like he was carrying tons of weight on his back. The heat of life seemed merciless, and the little strength he had, he used only to survive. It was in this state that one day, sitting on the sidewalk in front of his own house, he simply froze. He cried silently. His hands were sweaty, his eyes red, and his breathing was uneven. It was there, with no one around, that he noticed a kind of shadow forming. Not a physical shadow, but a real sensation that something was covering him. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if a relief was pushing the despair away. It wasn't exactly comfort, but a presence, a peace unlike any he had ever felt. A pause. He remembered Psalm 91. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will abide under the shadow of the Almighty. But for the first time, he understood that it wasn't poetry. It was an invitation. That shadow wasn't the end of the desert, but the beginning of a choice. God wasn't taking Marcelo out of the difficulty, but he was calling him to dwell with him, within it, to remain, to rest in the presence, not to run away. It was then that he understood. The shadow of the Most High is not a place of passage. It is a dwelling place, and an address requires a decision. Many people seek God as if they were seeking shade for a few minutes. They come, rest a little, but then go back to walking alone. Marcelo understood that day that Psalm 91 was not a magical promise. It was a pact of permanence, and that would require much more than praying in difficult times. It would require staying when nothing changed. Continuing to trust when the desert persisted. It was not easy. He knew that many were only looking for temporary relief, but few were willing to dwell with God amid the heat of trials. And perhaps that is why few truly experienced rest. Marcelo chose to dwell, and that decision, on that seemingly ordinary day, would change everything. After that day when he felt the shadow of the Almighty in the middle of the desert, Marcelo began to repeat to himself, "God is my refuge." It was almost a mantra. He said it when he woke up. He said it on the way to work. He said it in the silence of prayers. He said, with tears in his eyes. But the more he repeated it, the more a question began to nudge his conscience. Did he really trust? Or was he just trying to convince himself of something that was not yet real to him? Refuge is where we hide. And yes, Marcelo hid. He hid his pain, his traumas, his frustration with life. He used faith as a shield, but without realizing it, he did not let God touch the deepest parts. It was as if I wanted shelter, but without internal reform. I wanted protection, but without surrender. Over time, he began to realize that the psalm does not stop at taking refuge. It also says, "my fortress." And that touched him. Because a fortress is not just for hiding, it is for resisting, for standing up, for fighting. And then it dawned on him, perhaps God did not want to just protect him from the world, but to strengthen him to face it. And this part of the process was the most painful. Marcelo needed to learn to trust even when divine protection did not mean immediate relief, to trust when prayers were not answered, to trust when fear still gripped his chest. Little by little, he began to realize that faith was not just running to God when everything fell apart, but standing with God when everything remained difficult. The fortress that God wanted to build in him was invisible, but unshakable. This shift in understanding began in a simple conversation with a friend. They were having coffee, and the friend asked, "Do you think you're trusting God, or are you just trying to avoid falling apart?" The question kept echoing. That's when he understood. To truly trust is to give up control. It's to not have all the answers, but still to follow through. It was a shock because Marcelo was the kind of person who needed plans, guarantees, an escape route, and God was taking all of that out of his hands. Refuge is where you run to hide. Fortress is what you become after you stand. Marcelo no longer wanted to live in hiding. He wanted to resist. And it was exactly at that point that his faith stopped being a theory and became real life. Marcelo always thought that the greatest dangers came from outside. Toxic people, difficult situations, attacks from the enemy. All of these were easy to identify and even pray against. But it was during a sleepless night when he tried to pray and only managed to cry that he realized something disconcerting. Perhaps the fowler's snare, mentioned in the psalm, was not outside, but inside him. The thoughts he harbored, the silent comparisons with other people, the constant feeling of not being enough. These were the traps that trapped him every day. And the worst part, he set them himself. Not because he wanted to, but because he didn't realize it. Marcelo found himself repeating phrases like, "Nothing will change. This is a waste of time. I'm not like the others." And each of these phrases became an invisible rope around his soul. That was when he realized that Psalm 91 speaks of liberation, but it doesn't say that this liberation will come without confrontation. God wouldn't free him from what he pretended didn't exist. And that was one of the most difficult moments of the process. Because you can't face an enemy you refuse to acknowledge. Marcelo had to stop pretending to be strong. He had to admit his flaws, his fears, his escapes. He had to face his negative thoughts head on. He started writing down everything he thought about himself in a notebook, and was shocked by what he read. There was more guilt and self-judgment than faith and hope. He understood that, in order to be free, he would have to start from within. And God, in his grace, didn't abandon him in this part. It was in this silent outburst that the healing began to germinate. It didn't happen overnight, but he realized that every time he confessed his limitations in prayer, something inside him broke in the best way possible. The invisible traps began to lose their strength, not because everything around him changed, but because he began to think differently. The greatest hunter of his peace was not the devil, nor other people. It was himself when he let insecurity take over. And when he understood this, Marcelo stopped living on the edge of the abyss and began to walk more lightly. Psalm 91 became more real with each step, because now he was not only asking for deliverance, he was allowing God to free him from what he himself had built. And this was perhaps the hardest, but also the most liberating part of the entire journey. Marcelo began to notice a strange pattern in his days. During the morning and afternoon, it was as if he were being hit by invisible blows, little words, looks, comments that hurt more than he cared to admit. Sometimes they came from co-workers, sometimes from his own family. Subtle things, but they hurt like well-aimed arrows. He would come home tired, but the worst was yet to come. When night fell, silence came. And with the silence, thoughts. His mind would not stop. He felt as if the night terrors mentioned in Psalm 91 were not ghosts or demons. They were memories, doubts, guilt, uncertainties. He would toss and turn in bed, unable to rest. It was as if he were living at war 24 hours a day. One day, exhausted, Marcelo read the passage again. "You shall not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day." That sounded different. It wasn't a promise that the attacks would stop. It was an invitation not to fear. God didn't promise that he wouldn't be hit, but that he would have peace even in the midst of crossfire. And at that moment he understood. The secret was not to protect himself from everything, but to trust even when the arrows were still flying, even when fear came at dawn, suffocating his chest. It was hard. There were nights when he could only sleep with the Bible under his pillow, and days when the only shield he could find were the prayers whispered inside the bus, with his eyes closed and his heart racing. But little by little, Marcelo began to feel something changing inside. Trusting God didn't make the attacks go away. It made them lose their power to control his life. He stopped waiting for everything to calm down before he could feel peace. He began to realize that true security came not from external circumstances, but from the presence of God, who was with him day and night. That didn't mean he never cried or was shaken again. But now, when words hurt and fear crept in the darkness, he knew where to hide. The shadow of the Almighty didn't disappear with the rising of the sun. It was with him. And with each attack he survived, his faith grew a little bit more. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. And that was the difference he never forgot. That week, it seemed like the world was falling apart. Marcelo received 3 messages on the same day. A friend lost his job, another ended a long-term marriage, and a cousin was hospitalized in serious condition. He remained silent for a few minutes, trying to understand why everything was falling apart around him. The phrase from Psalm 91 echoed in his head. 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. That shook him, not as an arrogant relief, but as a question. Why am I still standing? The answer did not come with thunder or revelations. It came at breakfast in the soft praise on his cell phone, in the whispered prayer before leaving. It was as if God sustained him with almost imperceptible details. Peace that was not noisy, but continuous. This peace did not mean an absence of problems. Marcelo also faced dilemmas, overdue bills, internal crises. But there was something different about him. He was not falling apart. And it wasn't because he was stronger or more spiritual. It was because he had made a daily choice to trust. Even when nothing made sense, he would stand before God and say, I am here, hold me up. That was what kept him standing, and he realized that the promise of the psalm was not that he would not see falls. It was that he would remain steadfast, even in the midst of chaos. There was no magic in that. There was perseverance, and a faith that was built in the silence, in the ordinary days, in the moments when no one was looking. It was also during this phase that Marcelo understood something even more profound. It wasn't just about not falling. It was about staying with purpose. God didn't keep him standing so he would feel better than others, but so he could be a comfort to those who had fallen. He started calling his friends, praying with them, listening more, and curiously, the more he helped, the more solid he felt. The stability that God gave him wasn't for show, it was for service, and this changed the way he saw the suffering around him. He stopped asking himself, why didn't I fall? And started praying, how can I be a support to those who had fallen? That's when he understood staying standing is a privilege, yes, but it's also a mission. That Sunday, the news kept reporting tragedies, floods, violence, financial crises. Marcelo turned off the TV with a heavy heart. He had reason to worry. He lived in an unstable region, earned little, and took care of his elderly mother. But that same night, when he opened his Bible, he came across Psalm 91. No evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling. That kept ringing in his mind. What do you mean, no plague? He saw calamities every day, including within his own family. But then it hit him. God never promised that evil would not knock on the door, but that it would not come in to destroy those who live in him. A truly protected home is not made of bricks. It is the heart that has made God its home. Marcelo understood this very clearly when months later he lost the little he had in a flood. Everything material was gone. Furniture, clothes, documents, but strangely he did not despair. There was sadness, of course, but there was no helplessness. He remembered a prayer he prayed every day. Lord, dwell in me, and teach me to dwell in you. It was as if, in that crisis, the house inside became stronger than ever. It was there that he discovered the difference between those who only visit God in difficult times and those who live with him every day. Because those who live in the hiding place of the Almighty may, even cry over their losses, but they do not collapse completely. The inner structure resists, and no one can take that away. The calamity hit him from the outside, but it couldn't corrupt what was inside. And that made all the difference in the rebuilding. Marcelo didn't just rebuild his physical house, he reconnected with the peace that came from God's constant presence. Over time, he recovered part of what he had lost. But above all, he discovered a strength he didn't know he had. It wasn't his own. It was the fruit of communion with the Father. He never looked at Psalm 91 the same way again. Now he knew. The home where God dwells may even be visited by the storm, but it will never be destroyed by it. Because those who are kept in the Lord carry a shelter that cannot be torn away, not by pain or loss. Marcelo was returning from a choice he knew was not pleasing to God. It wasn't the first time. He had promised himself that he wouldn't repeat certain mistakes, but there he was, driving back home with a heavy heart. The guilt was hitting him hard, and the shame seemed more present than God, until, on a curve, he almost lost control of the car. A truck braked suddenly in the other lane, and the accident was millimeters away. He parked the car, trembling. He took a deep breath, and at that moment Psalm 91 came to mind. He will give his angels charge over you to guard you in all your ways. Marcelo cried, because he knew that this was not a good path. But even so, he was guarded. That left a deep impression. For the first time, he felt that God's protection was not a reward for merit, but an expression of love, even in the midst of mistakes. This did not diminish the responsibility he felt for his decisions, but it revealed the mercy that still reached him. Marcelo did not use this as an excuse to continue making mistakes. On the contrary, that deliverance affected him so much that it prompted him to change. He understood that stumbling did not make him unworthy of divine care, only human care, and God, with his grace, did not withdraw the angels just because he failed. God was still there, waiting for him to return. The stumble, in this case, was not the end. It was the turning point. Since then, Marcelo has come to view his mistakes differently, not with pride or indifference, but with humility. He learned that part of the walk with God involves falling, yes, but it mainly involves accepting being lifted up. And oddly enough, it was in this recognition of his own fragility that he most experienced God's strength. The idea that angels only protect the perfect was shattered on that asphalt that night. The truth is that God sends help even when we are far from the right place, because in the end, he wants to bring us back. And Marcelo discovered that the real miracle was not falling. It was having someone reach out to help him when he thought he had gone too far. The problem with Marcelo wasn't just what was going wrong. It was what he didn't even realize was wrong. The lion of anxiety had been roaring loudly for weeks. Problems at work, family pressure, sleepless nights. But there was something quieter, more sneaky, that he only noticed later: the poison of comparison. On social media, everyone seemed to be winning in life. Perfect marriages, trips, promotions, and he was struggling to pay the bills. Little by little, that began to erode his faith without him realizing it. The lion roared in front of him, but the viper bit from behind, and the poison was subtle. You are not enough. God has forgotten you. That was the voice whispering inside him. But it was during a simple, unpretentious service that something changed. A preacher he didn't even know read Psalm 91. You will tread upon the lion and the adder. The young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Marcelo froze. It wasn't just about obvious attacks. It was about discernment. God was showing him that not all enemies shout. Some whisper. And that often the greatest danger is what we can't see. After that service, he began to pay closer attention to his thoughts. He stopped making comparisons. He began to declare spiritual truths about himself, even when he felt nothing. And little by little the roaring lost its strength, and the poison was neutralized by the truth. He understood that God did not call him just to survive the attacks, but to walk above them. The promise of the psalm was not about escape, but about authority. It was not about avoiding confrontation, but about overcoming it, and that changed everything. With each destructive thought, Marcelo prayed out loud. With each emotional attack, he sought refuge in the Word. And he realized that God was not only watching over him, he was training him. Because those who tread on lions and serpents are not fragile, they are forged in trust. And it was in this way, without fanfare, that Marcelo found his balance again. Not because his enemies disappeared, but because he learned to face them with the certainty that he was not alone. And that made him stronger than ever. Marcelo had always heard the name of God. He grew up listening to it in church, singing praises, memorizing phrases that spoke of his greatness. But he only realized the difference when he began to recognize the name of God as something alive in his life, and not just a familiar sound. It was in a moment of deep crisis, when everything seemed to be falling apart, that he felt the real presence of that name. He was not just quoting the name of God to himself, but walking with him, feeling the protection manifest. That name became a real shelter, an invisible shield that accompanied him in every step. It was not just a word, it was a constant presence. Over time, he realized that knowing God's name goes far beyond repeating cliches. It is a relationship, an intimacy built on prayer, surrender, and trust. Marcelo began to speak to God as if he were speaking to a close friend, confessing his weaknesses, asking for strength and thanking him for the small victories. This true connection changed his perspective. When the attacks came, he did not despair. The name he recognized was more powerful than any problem. He understood that divine protection is not in human strength, but in the power to walk alongside that name that is above all names. This learning did not come easily, nor did it come suddenly. There were days and nights of struggle, doubts, and searching. But when Marcelo finally realized that walking with God was much more than hearing about him, his life changed forever. He felt that the protection promised in Psalm 91 was directly linked to his true surrender, to his courage to open up and trust. The name of God, which before seemed distant, became the anchor that kept him firm in the midst of the storms. And this true relationship, made of faith and presence, is what protects him to this day, not only from external dangers, but also from the internal storms that we all face. There was a time in Marcelo's life when he silently cried out in his heart, asking for an answer that never seemed to come. He prayed every day, sharing his fears and requests, but silence seemed to be the only answer. It was as if God was distant, indifferent to his suffering. That pain was real, heavy, and the feeling of abandonment almost made him give up. But something inside him resisted, a small flame of hope that still believed that God was there, even without speaking. And it was in that silence that Marcelo began to understand a new form of answer. It was not the absence of God, but his presence within the fire. He realized that God's answer is often not to pull you out of the storm, but to walk alongside you in the midst of it. Marcelo felt that even when he seemed alone, the divine presence was with him, giving him the strength to carry on. It wasn't the quick fix he wanted, but the peace he needed to bear the weight of the struggle. God's silence didn't mean abandonment, but a deep form of intimacy, where he learned to trust even without understanding everything. That constant, invisible presence was more real than any word or gesture, and this truth changed his way of praying forever. Over time, Marcelo's prayer stopped being just a request and became a dialogue. He began to talk to God in silence, accepting that he would not always receive clear answers, but trusting that his presence was enough. This experience transformed his faith, making it more mature and true. Marcelo learned that praying is not just about talking, but being willing to listen and accept, even when there is no audible voice. And it was in this way, in the midst of the silence that seemed empty, that he found the greatest proof of love. God was not far away. He was within him, supporting each step. This certainty became his greatest comfort and strength to continue. Marcelo never imagined that the greatest transformation of his life would come after so much anguish. He went through difficult days, sleepless nights, moments when he even doubted his own worth. But it was right there, in the midst of this pain, that something changed inside him. God did not promise that he would be spared from suffering, but that at the end of the journey there would be honor, not the kind that the world gives, but the kind that comes from overcoming and unshakable faith. Marcelo felt that this honor was a silent recognition, a profound change that only those who face the struggle know the weight of. Over time, he realized that this honor was not a trophy to show off, but an inner mark. It was the feeling of having been molded, hardened, and at the same time softened by the presence of God in every difficult moment. Marcelo no longer wanted to run away from the pain because he knew that it was teaching him something important. Each tear, each challenge faced, built an invisible fortress within him. Anguish had been the furnace that purified him, and honor was his new identity, an identity made of courage, faith, and true transformation. Today, Marcelo carries this honor like a seal that no one can take away. He knows he is not perfect, but that his story is a living testimony of God's power to change lives. This honor gives him the strength to move forward, even when the storms return. And he understands that true value lies in having walked with God through suffering and coming out different than when he went in. Stronger, more confident, and above all, more human. This honor, he knows, is what sustains him every day, and that it can never be taken away. Marcelo heard the promise of many years of life as something distant, almost abstract. For him, what really mattered was what he would do with each day that was given to him. After everything he had been through, he understood that it was not enough to accumulate time. One must live with purpose. There was a moment when he realized that many around him were living in a hurry, running around without meaning, while he was searching for real meaning in his steps. Life took on a new color when he decided not only to exist, but to live each day as a gift, a present to be used with intention. This change had a profound impact on Marcelo's routine. He began to value time with his family, to invest in himself and the people around him, and to pursue something that made his heart beat faster. It wasn't a list of empty goals, but a sincere commitment to a life that reflected his values and faith. The promise of Psalm 91 stopped being a mere expectation and became a real motivation to transform the present. He understood that fulfillment lies in living each moment with the awareness that time is limited and precious. Today, Marcelo does not count the years, but the experiences he collects with purpose. He knows that the life that God offers is not only long, but rich in meaning. And this keeps him strong, even in the face of the difficulties that still arise. This new way of living does not exempt him from suffering, but it gives him the strength to face each challenge as part of a greater plan. And so, he walks with a heart full of hope, knowing that the many years promised are, in fact, a daily opportunity to make every moment count. Marcelo discovered that salvation is not just a promise for the future, but a reality that can be experienced in the present. Even in the midst of life's storms, there was a joy that no one could take away from him. It was a deep peace that came from the certainty that, regardless of the circumstances, he belonged to something greater. This joy was not to be confused with fleeting happiness, but was a constant light that shone in his heart, feeding his hope and sustaining his faith. In every difficult moment, he could feel this presence that gave him the strength to move forward. The joy of salvation transformed the way Marcelo faced daily challenges. He realized that even in the most difficult situations, there was a reason to be thankful, a lesson hidden in every struggle. This joy became an armor against discouragement, a constant reminder that he was not alone. He understood that this salvation is a gift that does not depend on external conditions, but on his intimate connection with God. This certainty brought a serenity that the world could neither offer nor take away. Today, Marcelo carries this joy like a priceless treasure. It is the fuel that drives him and the reason he never gives up. The joy of salvation is living proof that true faith can withstand any storm. And this joy, he knows, is what keeps him strong, even when everything around him seems to be falling apart. It is the sign that, despite the pain and losses, victory is already his, because he has found something that the world can never take away. Marcelo learned that Psalm 91 is not a magic formula to ward off problems or guarantee a life without difficulties. The true protection it offers comes from a sacred pact, a profound alliance between those who dwell in the secret place of the Most High and God Himself. This alliance requires surrender, trust, and courage to remain firm, even when everything seems to fall apart. It is not about avoiding suffering, but about finding the strength to face it with the certainty that we are not alone. Over time, he understood that living in the presence of God is a daily commitment, a choice that needs to be renewed every moment. It is not enough to simply seek shade when the heat is on. It is necessary to remain there, to learn to live in dependence on the one who is true strength. This intimacy transforms fear into confidence, doubt into faith, and despair into hope. For Marcelo, this secret of the psalm was the turning point that changed his entire trajectory. Today, he lives knowing that God's protection is not an invisible shield against difficulties, but a force that sustains him in the midst of them. This certainty keeps him going, even when the storm rages around him. The pact he made cannot be broken by external circumstances because it is rooted in something greater than himself. And this certainty is what Marcelo carries as a legacy, an unexpected lesson that transformed his life forever. Getting here and understanding the true meaning of Psalm 91 is more than just knowing an ancient text. It is realizing that living under God's protection is a calling to truly dwell with Him, in good times and in difficult times. It is not about avoiding storms, but about finding strength, courage, and peace within the shadow of the Almighty. And this is a journey that each of us can choose to take, with faith and commitment. Now, I want to know from you, what was the greatest test that taught you to trust in God, even when everything seemed lost? Share your story or your opinion in the comments, because your experience can inspire other people who are facing silent battles. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos that can transform your life and your faith. And if you want to continue on this journey, take the opportunity to watch the other videos on the channel. Each one brings teachings and stories that will strengthen your soul. Thank you very much for being here, for your company, and for being part of this community. Until the next video, may you be in peace and in the protection of the Lord.